Hello, everyone. I wanted to share with you a lecture that I actually created for a different class, for 608 in program planning. That class was about frameworks, but the part that I pulled out of that lecture is the part on developing a logic model. So if you are in the program planning class, this content on logic models will be the same as you received or participated in Module 2. For those of you in grant writing, I hope you'll think about this as a possible way of thinking through how you would implement your project so that you can also use visuals and graphics to communicate about your project in a grants context. So particularly if you're thinking of working in the nonprofit or educational fields, I think it's well worth your time to explore this content on developing logic models. Now, logic models are defined differently by different theorists. I happen to like these two definitions from the Kellogg Foundation and then from a scientific author. I actually found both of these quotes from an online article in what you might think of as an unlikely source, but the Astronomical Society produced a beautiful piece on how to develop and implement logic models. And sometimes I find it's good to think about a concept like this outside of your own field of study. So if you tend to learn well that way, I suggest you follow this link and read his discussion of logic models. You'll see that I took both of these quotes from his article. So the first is this idea that we're talking about a systematic and visual way to present and share your understanding of the relationships, that's critical, we're talking about interrelated parts here, among the resources that you have to operate your program. You also want to specify the activities you plan to do and the changes or results you hope to achieve. In another definition, we have the model describes logical linkages among program resources, activities, outputs, audiences, short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes related to a specific problem or situation. So we kind of see in these two definitions how different the nonprofit sector can be from the more academic research sector. But in general, logic models have an awful lot in common, and those two definitions are quite complementary. They're just expressed differently from their different cultures. So logic models are hypothesized things. So the term model means it's something we intend to do. It's something we're striving for. It's hypothetical at this point, but it's going to help us make a plan so that we can try to make our ideals realized in real life. Logic models are really sets of assumptions and series of if-then relationships that you can portray in a visually rich way so that a reader can look at it and get both a big picture gestalt of what your program's about, as well as a working idea of how it's structured and how it will roll out over time. So logic models are going to illustrate the developmental process that you have planned for a particular program. It usually covers this process from the time you get your first idea and you're trying to collaboratively design this program. So it covers from inception to impact, which is when your program's been operating for a while and now you want to look to see if it has in fact made any changes that are really meaningful in your setting of interest. Logic models give us this fairly consistent structure which allows us to communicate with each other about these things, and as I've mentioned, it's particularly critical in a multidisciplinary context, which we're often in human services and public health planning. So the logic model is an excellent planning tool for program developers. It once again gives you the big picture. It's systems-based, and it encourages developers to think about how the parts of the program are interrelated. It also helps developers understand and clarify their underlying assumptions for their program. And by questioning different aspects as you discuss the elements of a logic model, you're often going to be strengthening the logic of your approach. Logic models usually present in what we would call a sequenced flow model, meaning that it usually goes from left to right and demonstrates a dynamic process, often a process that's going to have a sort of cycle of repeating amongst or between elements. So a sequenced flow model really helps developers think about timelines and tasks and helps us plan for when we will do evaluations or assessments of particular components of our program. So we understand why program developers might rely on logic models, but who else would use a logic model and why? Well, program evaluators are just as dependent on carefully specified logic models as program developers. So they will use them to organize their data and to guide everything from data collection to analysis. And this is very helpful because then the people who have developed the intervention, which really are oftentimes independent of the people who are evaluating the intervention, those two groups of people can have a shared way of organizing information about the important elements of the program. It's also important for stakeholders to understand the program logic and be able to participate more fully in the development of the program planning process. So when I say stakeholders, once again, we're referring to not only the professional program developers who might be nonprofit executives or people who are working in prevention science or public health. We have the experts, so to speak, in the execution of these efforts, and we have the people in the community who are impacted by the social problem that the scientists are caring about. So that could include everyone from people who are going to help you build awareness for the project, people who are experiencing the social problem that you're studying, people who are in the same environment as others who are experiencing the social problem. So there's a wide variety of stakeholder groups you may want to represent in your planning process, but those are usually involving lay people. And by lay people, I mean they may not have any formal training past middle school or high school and may really need to get on the same page with a group of people from a often highly educated community that is really working toward communicating complex ideas in a way that are accessible and that can obtain the kind of input we really need from members of our community. So frameworks give us this common language, really, and helps us transfer knowledge back and forth between our program staff and our stakeholders. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that logic models help us communicate effectively with funders. And the program evaluation process is going to be as transparent as possible for funders because the outcome data that are generated from evaluations are going to be utilized in deciding which programs really deserve more resources, who's going to get the funding. So logic models can look different in different contexts, and there's no one sort of right way to do a logic model. Different fields may have their preferences, however. So what I'm going to try to do here in the next few slides is give you a sense of different kinds of logic models based on the fields of study they're coming from. So this first one comes from the article that I mentioned from the Astronomical Society, and I just thought it was a really good graphic for talking about the components of a logic model, or the anatomy of a logic model. So this model includes 6 components. It has inputs, activities, outputs, short-term outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and impact. So you can see here in this chart there's a definition in the first row for what each of those components is, and then there are examples of things that would fall within that component. So for example, your inputs, pardon me, those are the resources you're going to put into the program. It's the people, it's the money, it's the capital, it's the support. Those inputs are then going to be translated into activities. This is what you're going to do with those resources, and it could include things like training or developing guidelines. Outputs are the things you create through your activities, Sort of the translation from input to output is through activities, and this could be things like a training workshop. Short-term outcomes are changes you want to see immediately after your output is out there or relatively quickly. So we would think of these as proximal or short-term outcomes, and they often include things like changes in attitudes or beliefs. Intermediate outcomes often have their own column in a logic model, and you would expect these a little farther down the line. And these might include changes in behavior or procedures within an organization. Impact in logic models is thought of differently than outcomes. Impact has to do with the changes in the context around this program as a result of the intervention. So impact is really what have the outcomes done to make things better in this setting. So those could be social impacts, economic impacts, health impacts, all of that. Most logic models are also divided in two, where the first part of the model reflects assumptions or intentions. So those are things that are planned, and we are assuming that they're going to happen. The second half of the model often relates to the external factors, where we want to see what's actually happening in the world once we have implemented our program. Another way of looking at logic models comes from a community housing agency, which I provide the link for here. This article is also quite interesting. I like this example because it's pretty simple and it helps us get more flexible with the structure of a logic model. You begin with inputs. Those are the resources needed to operate a program. For example, in housing, it's the idea that you need some staff time to develop their housing program, and they need to work with construction developers who are willing to take advantage of their particular housing incentive program. So the inputs and the activities are two aspects of the planned work that this community housing foundation is going to do. One of the activities is to look at the bonus density provided in the exchange. You know what? I'm not quite sure what that activity is. That is outside my field of study. But what I can see is that they're going to do something that they think is going to help translate their inputs, their relationship with developers, their staff time, as they're trying to create these outputs. And what they're working toward are 10 affordable housing units per year. So the idea is that in this logic model, the output question is answered by saying, hey, if these activities are accomplished, then this amount of service will be delivered. Outcomes basically addresses the question, and if those outputs are achieved, then this is the change that we're going to see. And in this example, you have a change in the number of low-income renters that are cost burdened. You're decreasing a stressor. Then impacts have to do with if the outcomes are achieved, then the city or county will change in this way. So impact is really a reflection of the ecology or the context around the program. A third way of looking at a logic model comes from the education system. And here you've got a very familiar set of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. But what you may see is a different kind of flow when it comes to looking at how they are connecting various elements to others. So I wanted to provide this example if your background is more in the educational field so that you can see how they may conceptualize a very similar framework. So in general, logic models are going to share a lot of common elements, but they're also going to vary depending on the complexity and context of your project. And it's important to keep in mind that developing a logic model is a dynamic process. They should be thought of as an ongoing work in progress, and you'll need to be revisiting it from time to time. Developing them requires some practice, and it requires ongoing collaboration. But if you do it well, it will really help you develop a more efficient and persuasive program development process. So let's take a look at an example of a logic model that comes from that astronomy website that I mentioned. So the example they provide is they're looking into a literacy program using astronomy because it's high interest to try to improve reading skills for youth in Sierra Leone who have experienced a lot of poverty and war. So you have a model here for their inputs, their activities, their outputs, their short-term outcomes, and their intermediate outcomes. If this particular example would be useful to you, I suggest that you follow the link to the website and you can read the entire account of what their program was about and then how they developed this logic model. So now that you've seen a couple of examples of logic models and we've thought about how dynamic they are, let's also consider the limitations of logic models because you don't want to expect more from them than they will actually provide. So first of all, logic models are only as good as the foundations that you place underneath them. So the usefulness of a specific logic model is really going to rely on the validity of your underlying assumptions. So as you are building those first 2 or 3 columns of the model, keep in mind it's hypothetical, it's intentional, but you want it to be realistic. It's also important to know that logic models emphasize expected outcomes, so they may overlook unintended outcomes. Those could be unintended positive outcomes, and so you want to try to operationalize some outside of the box thinking in case you can achieve those. You may also find that there are unintended negative outcomes, and we don't want to miss that as we are planning and revising our programs. Logic models by design provide an overly simplistic look at a set of really complex processes. That's what they are designed to do. And you may feel a little impatient reading them if it feels like you're just circling the content, you're not getting to enough meat. Well, what's important to keep in mind is think of logic models as like the infrastructure of your program. You're going to work within that infrastructure and going to drill deeper and deeper to every single component. This is just like the most basic roadmap that you're working from. So just keep in mind that it's an overly simple model. That way, you won't be too thrown if you find that you have to revise it significantly before your next wave of implementation. It's also important to remember that as human beings, we want to see the things we want to see. So a logic model can make things look more linear and more stable than they actually are, when in fact, each element could have a significant impact on any of the other elements in the model, even in ways that we didn't think that the arrows would connect from element to element. So these models are a starting point, and they depict a dynamic, mutually interactive set of processes. And if you change one little part of the model, it's likely to have some downstream effects so that other parts of the model are also going to be impacted. And that's not a bad thing. You're trying to incite change, and your logic model is probably going to need to respond to that. As you are impacting your community or your community is being impacted by other forces, your logic model will need to be adjusted. So this is a really important area to become fluent in, particularly if you are looking at any sort of career in human services program provision where you will be in the role of communicating about program development, seeking funding for programs, or being in an executive director or director of development role. This would also be an important set of expertise to master if you're looking at a role in community-based public health. Because you'll be working with a lot of community coalitions. And any sort of health promotion effort or work to bring evidence-based programs into schools is also increasingly relying on a logic model approach. So depending on the context that you are interested in, you may find these resources to be useful. The one that I'd like to point out that I keep as a bookmark on my laptop is the University of Kansas Community Toolbox. I'm so impressed by what the team of researchers and graphic designers have put together here. It's a very accessible, practical set of tools, and you can explore a variety of topics and applications of a logic model framework by going through those toolbox resources. So thank you for your time and attention in this brief lecture on logic models. What you see on the screen are the references that I relied upon in putting together this talk. I hope that you'll find it to be a useful tool as you think about ways to visually communicate with the reader of your grant proposals.